September 1607, at the beach at Rathmullen in County Donegal, Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, stands at the water's edge, watching a French ship drop anchor in the bay. Behind him, 99 Irish nobles, earls, chiefs, their families, prepare to board. They're carrying what they can: documents, heirlooms, memories, everything else they're leaving behind. O'Neill is 67 years old. He's spent 40 years navigating the impossible space between two worlds, raised in English court, educated in English ways, yet heir to the most ancient Gaelic dynasty in Ireland. He fought the English for 9 years, nearly won, but lost everything at Kinsale 6 years ago. Now even the compromise is impossible. The English want total control, total transformation, total submission. He boards the ship. Red Hugh O'Donnell's brother Rory joins him, along with Cuchonnacht Maguire of Fermanagh and dozens of other lords whose families have ruled Irish territories for centuries, some for 1,000 years. The ship's sails catch the wind. Ireland grows smaller behind them. None of them will ever see their homeland again. This moment, the flight of the Earls, marks the end of Gaelic Ireland. The end of a civilization that had survived Vikings, Normans, and centuries of English pressure. Within months, their lands will be confiscated. Within years, Scottish and English settlers will occupy their territories. The Ulster plantation will begin. But how did this happen? How did Ireland go from the island of saints and scholars, the beacon of European learning during the Dark Ages, to a conquered colony where its own lords chose exile over submission? The story begins 1,200 years earlier, when the Roman Empire was collapsing and Ireland was about to embark on its golden age. Picture the year 400 AD. While Roman Britain crumbled and continental Europe descended into chaos, Ireland remained untouched by Rome's fall. No legions had ever conquered this island. No Roman roads crossed its landscape. And in that isolation, something remarkable was about to flourish. Ireland in 400 AD was divided into approximately 150 small kingdoms called tuatha, essentially independent territories that could be crossed in a single day's march. Each tuath controlled roughly 300 square kilometers and supported between 1,000 and 3,000 people. These weren't primitive tribal units, but sophisticated political entities with complex social structures, legal systems, and economic networks. The tuath represented the fundamental building block of Irish society, with boundaries following natural features like rivers, hills, and bogs that made geographic sense for defense and resource management. Each tuath was ruled by a ri, a king whose authority derived from royal bloodline, military prowess, and the support of the local nobility, known as the flatha. The system operated on principles of personal loyalty and reciprocal obligation that bound together different social classes through intricate networks of clientship. Free farmers called Baer formed the backbone of this society, owing military service and tribute to their local king while maintaining rights to their land and livestock. Below them stood the unfree classes, including fuidir and slaves captured in raids or born into bondage. But above even the nobility rose the Aos Dana, the skilled professional classes, including brehons and craftsmen whose expertise transcended tuath boundaries. The brehons were the legal scholars who memorized and interpreted Irish law, a sophisticated oral legal tradition that covered everything from land disputes to personal injury to marriage contracts. These laws, collectively known as Brehon law, would govern Irish society for over 1,000 years. They recognized 8 types of marriage, set compensation values for injuries based on social status, and established complex inheritance patterns that prioritized the collective welfare of the extended family over individual ownership. This wasn't a primitive society, this was a civilization with its own universities, its own legal experts, its own poets who trained for 12 years to master their craft. Irish society had been functioning this way for centuries when Christianity arrived. not through Roman conquest, but through a different kind of revolution. Around 432 AD, a man named Patrick returned to Ireland. He'd been here before as a slave, captured by Irish raiders from his home in Roman Britain when he was 16. After 6 years of captivity, he'd escaped. Now he was back as a missionary, and he understood something crucial. To convert Ireland, you had to convert the kings first. Patrick's mission differed fundamentally from earlier Christian evangelization efforts because he worked systematically to convert the ruling classes, understanding that religious change in Irish society flowed from the top down through existing patronage networks. His strategy involved establishing churches near existing centers of political power, often converting royal sites or locations already considered sacred in pre-Christian tradition. Patrick's own writings, particularly his Confessio and his letter to Coroticus, provide rare contemporary insights into 5th century Ireland. He describes a landscape dotted with ring forts and scattered settlements where cattle raids between neighbouring Tuatha were common and where Druids still wielded considerable influence over legal and religious matters. The integration of Christianity with existing Celtic religious practices created a uniquely Irish form of medieval Christianity that retained many indigenous elements: sacred wells, groves, and hilltops that had served as focal points for pre-Christian worship were often incorporated into the new religious landscape, with Christian saints replacing local deities in popular devotion. The festival calendar similarly blended Christian holy days with traditional Celtic seasonal celebrations. Imbolc became St. Brigid's Day, Beltane transformed into May Day observances, Lugnasad merged with harvest festivals, and Samhain eventually became All Saints' Day. This wasn't accidental, it was brilliant cultural synthesis that allowed Christianity to take root without completely destroying the culture it was transforming. But the real revolution came with Irish monasticism. Between 450 and 600 AD, Ireland developed a monastic system unlike anything in continental Europe. Instead of following standardized rules like Benedict's, Irish monasteries grew organically around charismatic religious figures who attracted followers to remote locations. These communities initially developed their own customs based on the teachings of their founders and the practical requirements of survival in harsh environments. Clonmacnoise, founded by St. Cyran around 548 AD on the banks of the River Shannon, exemplifies this development. Its location at the intersection of important overland routes and river transport made it a natural gathering place for traders, pilgrims, and scholars. Within decades, Clonmacnoise had grown from a small hermitage into a substantial settlement featuring multiple churches, workshops, guest houses, and agricultural facilities capable of supporting hundreds of residents. The transformation was beginning. Ireland was about to become the intellectual beacon of the Western world. Glendalough, established by St. Kevin in the early 6th century in the Wicklow Mountains, represents another model of Irish monastic development. The community grew within a glacial valley that provided natural protection and abundant water resources, allowing the monks to create an almost self-sufficient settlement. The monastic school at Glendalough attracted students from across Ireland and eventually from continental Europe, developing a curriculum that combined Christian theology with traditional Irish learning in law, poetry, and natural philosophy. Think about what this meant. While cities across the former Roman Empire were declining, while literacy was becoming rare, while libraries were being destroyed, Irish monasteries were building schools, copying manuscripts, preserving knowledge. The monastery's library contained not only Christian texts, but also secular Irish literature, legal treatises, and historical annals that preserved knowledge of pre-Christian Irish culture. This synthesis of Christian and indigenous learning would become the hallmark of Irish monasticism and contribute to Ireland's later reputation as a centre of European scholarship. Bangor, founded by St Comgall around 558 AD on the shores of Belfast Lough, developed into one of Ireland's most influential monastic centres, known particularly for its rigorous ascetic practices and missionary activities. The monastery's rule emphasised physical hardship, extended fasting, and constant prayer as means of spiritual purification. Monks at Bangor typically lived in individual cells within the monastic enclosure, gathering only for communal prayers and meals that consisted primarily of bread, vegetables, and water. But here's what's remarkable: these weren't isolated hermits ignoring the world. The influence of Bangor extended far beyond Ireland through the missionary activities of its monks who carried Irish monastic traditions to Scotland, northern England, and continental Europe. St Columbanus, trained at Bangor, established monasteries in Gaul and northern Italy that introduced Irish monastic practices to continental European Christianity. These missionary efforts created networks of cultural and intellectual exchange that would prove crucial to Ireland's role in preserving and transmitting classical learning during the early medieval period. The economic foundations of these monastic communities rested on sophisticated systems of land management and resource exploitation that often surpassed those of secular settlements. Monasteries typically controlled extensive territories granted by local kings or wealthy patrons, including not only agricultural land but also forests, fisheries, and mineral resources. The monks developed innovative techniques for drainage, crop rotation, and livestock management that increased productivity and supported larger populations than traditional farming methods. This was Ireland's golden age beginning, and it was about to get even more extraordinary. Between 600 and 800 AD, Irish monasteries evolved into centres of unprecedented intellectual and artistic achievement, transforming Ireland into what contemporary European scholars recognised as the island of saints and scholars. This wasn't propaganda, it was accurate description of Ireland's position as perhaps the premier centre of learning in Western Europe. While Viking raids were beginning to disrupt monastic libraries across much of northern Europe, Irish monasteries continued to acquire and copy manuscripts from diverse sources. The library at Clonmacnoise contained not only standard Christian texts, but also works by classical authors such as Virgil, Ovid, and Cicero, alongside Irish legal texts, genealogies, and vernacular poetry that preserved pre-Christian cultural traditions. Picture the scriptoriums, monks bent over vellum pages made from calf skin, carefully ruling lines with lead points, mixing pigments from ground minerals and plant materials, copying texts in beautiful insular script. Each page took hours. Each manuscript took months or years. The monks working in Irish scriptoria developed a sophisticated system for organising and cross-referencing their collections, creating catalogues that listed works by subject matter, author, and availability for copying. The scriptorium at Armagh maintained separate sections for biblical texts, patristic writings, classical literature, and Irish vernacular materials, with specialised scribes assigned to each category based on their linguistic skills and subject expertise. The preservation of classical knowledge in Irish monasteries occurred through deliberate effort rather than accident. Irish scholars recognised the value of pre-Christian learning for understanding Christian theology and developing sophisticated arguments in theological debates. The curriculum at major monastic schools included the study of Latin grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic. The trivium that formed the foundation of medieval education, alongside Greek language instruction that was becoming increasingly rare in Western Europe. Advanced students at centres like Clonmacnoise and Glendalough studied works of natural philosophy, astronomy, and mathematics that provided intellectual tools for calculating feast days, understanding biblical chronology, and engaging with complex theological questions. The reputation of Irish monasteries as centres of learning attracted students from across Europe, creating international communities of scholars. The monastery school at Clonard, founded by St Finian in the early 6th century, became particularly renowned for its rigorous academic program that combined Christian theology with classical learning. Students spent years mastering Latin composition, memorizing extensive portions of scripture and patristic texts, and developing skills in biblical exegesis. But Ireland's greatest achievements weren't just intellectual, they were artistic. And what Irish monks created during this period would become some of the most beautiful objects ever made in medieval Europe. The Book of Durrow, created around 700 AD, demonstrates the high level of artistic skill achieved by Irish illuminators through its intricate geometric patterns, stylized animal forms, and sophisticated use of color. The manuscript's decorative program combines traditional Celtic spiral and interlace motifs with Christian iconography, creating a visual language that expressed both cultural continuity and religious transformation. The techniques employed in creating illuminated manuscripts required years of training and access to expensive materials. Scribes preparing vellum for illuminated manuscripts selected the finest calf skin, which was carefully cleaned, stretched, and treated with lime to create smooth, writing surfaces. The preparation of pigments involved grinding minerals, processing plant materials, and mixing binders that would preserve colors for centuries. But these achievements pale compared to what came next. The Book of Kells, produced during the late 8th or early 9th century, represents the pinnacle of Irish manuscript illumination, combining technical virtuosity with artistic vision in ways that continue to astonish modern viewers. The manuscript's full-page decorative compositions demonstrate mastery of geometric design principles that create complex visual effects through the interplay of pattern, color, and form. The famous Chi-Rho page transforms the opening letters of Christ's name in Greek into an elaborate composition that fills the entire page with interlacing patterns, stylized animals, and human figures that reward close examination with ever-increasing levels of detail. Look closely at the Book of Kells and you'll find cats and mice, angels and demons, abstract patterns that seem to move before your eyes. Some designs are so intricate that scholars believe they were created with magnifying lenses. The artistic program of the Book of Kells reflects the international character of Irish monasticism during this period, incorporating influences from Anglo-Saxon, Pictish, and continental European artistic traditions while maintaining distinctively Irish characteristics. Irish metalworkers during this period achieved equally impressive results in creating liturgical objects that combined functional requirements with artistic excellence. The Ardagh chalice, discovered in County Limerick but likely created during the 8th century, demonstrates the sophisticated techniques employed by Irish craftsmen in working precious metals. The chalice's construction required skills in casting, engraving, filigree work, and gem setting that represented the culmination of centuries of metalworking tradition. The vessel's decorative program incorporates Christian symbols with traditional Celtic motifs, creating a coherent artistic statement that expressed both religious devotion and cultural identity. This was Irish civilization at its peak, producing works of art that would be treasured for centuries, preserving knowledge that would help rebuild European civilization after the Dark Ages. But catastrophe was coming. From across the North Sea, dragon-prowed ships were approaching, and they carried men who cared nothing for books or beauty. They wanted gold, and they knew exactly where to find it. The monastery of Reshaped on Rathlin Island stood as a beacon of Irish monastic achievement when Viking longships first appeared on the horizon in 795 AD. The community housed perhaps 50 monks who had dedicated their lives to prayer, manuscript copying, and the preservation of learning. The island's position off the coast of Antrim provided what the monks believed was protective isolation, surrounded by treacherous currents and hidden rocks. This security proved illusory when Viking raiders navigating with skills honed in the fjords of Norway and the North Sea beached their shallow draft vessels on Rathlin's rocky shores. The attack on Reachru marked the beginning of a new era in Irish history. The Vikings who struck Rathlin Island were part of the same maritime expansion that had already brought Norse raiders to the Shetlands, Orkneys, and western Scotland. These weren't random pirates, but members of organised expeditions equipped with detailed knowledge of Irish coastal geography, monastic wealth, and seasonal patterns of vulnerability. The raiders knew that monasteries stored precious metals in the form of liturgical objects, maintained granaries filled with surplus crops, and housed communities of non-combatants who could be captured and sold as slaves in Scandinavian markets. The immediate impact reverberated throughout Irish monastic communities, which had developed over 2 centuries without serious external military threats. Monasteries like Clonmacnoise and Glendalough had accumulated substantial wealth through land grants, craft production, and pilgrimage offerings. The monks' dedication to learning had produced libraries containing hundreds of manuscripts written on expensive vellum, bound in covers decorated with precious metals and gems. These books represented not only spiritual and intellectual treasures, but also concentrated wealth that could be quickly stripped and transported back to Scandinavia. The Vikings' superior maritime technology gave them decisive advantages over Irish defenders who had developed military traditions focused on land-based warfare between neighbouring Tuatha. The longships that carried Viking raiders could navigate both open seas and shallow rivers, allowing attackers to strike deep into Ireland's interior before defenders could organise effective resistance. These vessels, typically measuring 60 to 70 feet in length, carried crews of 30 to 40 warriors who could beach their ships on any suitable shoreline, conduct rapid raids, and escape before local forces could respond. Viking raiding strategies evolved rapidly as commanders gained experience with Irish geography and defensive capabilities. The earliest raids focused on isolated monasteries and coastal settlements that offered minimal resistance and maximum plunder. The psychological impact extended far beyond immediate material damage. Irish society had developed during 2 centuries of relative external security, with conflicts limited to traditional cattle raids and territorial disputes. The sudden appearance of foreign warriors who showed no respect for Christian sanctity or Irish legal traditions shattered assumptions about the safety of monastic life. The annals record the destruction of books at monasteries in terms that suggest contemporaries understood they were witnessing the loss of irreplaceable cultural treasures. But then something changed. The Vikings stopped just raiding, they started staying. The transition from raiding to settlement began during the 830s and 840s as Viking leaders recognized the potential for establishing permanent bases that could support sustained military operations and commercial activities. The foundation of Dublin in 841 AD marked a crucial turning point, transforming sporadic raids into systematic colonization. The site chosen for Dublin offered exceptional strategic advantages, positioned at the mouth of the River Liffey, where ships could access both coastal and inland waters while maintaining easy communication with Scandinavia. The natural harbour provided shelter for large fleets, while the surrounding countryside offered agricultural resources capable of supporting a substantial population. The establishment of Dublin required careful planning and significant investment of resources that indicated Viking intentions extended far beyond simple raiding. The settlers constructed substantial earthwork fortifications that enclosed an area large enough to accommodate workshops, warehouses, residential areas, and defensive structures. Archaeological evidence suggests the early Viking settlement included specialized areas for metalworking, leather production, and shipbuilding that served both local needs and export markets. Dublin's location made it a natural centre for trade networks that connected Ireland with Scandinavia, Britain, and continental Europe. Viking merchants operating from Dublin established commercial relationships that brought Irish raw materials like hides, wool, and slaves to Scandinavian markets while importing finished goods, amber, and silver that enriched Irish material culture. The success of Dublin encouraged the establishment of similar Viking settlements at Cork, Waterford, and Limerick, each positioned to exploit particular geographic advantages and economic opportunities. Cork, founded at the mouth of the River Lee, provided access to the agricultural wealth of Munster, while serving as a base for raids into southwestern Ireland. Waterford, established where the River Suir meets the sea, controlled access to the interior of southeastern Ireland and served as a gateway for trade with Wales and southwestern England. Limerick, positioned on the River Shannon, near its confluence with the Abbey River, represented perhaps the most ambitious Viking settlement project. The town's location provided access to the Shannon navigation system that penetrated deep into Ireland's interior, allowing Viking traders and raiders to reach territories that had previously been protected by distance from the sea. These Viking towns introduced urban commercial practices that were largely unknown in traditional Irish society, which had developed around dispersed agricultural settlements and seasonal gathering places. Concentrated populations of Viking settlements created demands for specialized crafts and services that encouraged the development of full-time artisans, merchants, and service providers. But here's what's fascinating. These Viking invaders didn't remain foreign. Over time, they became Irish. They intermarried with Irish women. They converted to Christianity. They learned Irish. Within a few generations, you couldn't easily distinguish Viking-descended families from Irish ones. The Norse Irish had emerged, and one Irish king would use their military skills to nearly unite Ireland under single rule. Brian Boru's rise to power began in the shadow of Viking settlement, when the Dalji Case, his family dynasty, controlled only modest territories in modern County Clare. The transformation of this minor Munster kingdom into the dominant power in Ireland required not only military genius but also sophisticated understanding of how Viking settlement had changed Ireland's political landscape. The presence of Viking settlements at Dublin, Cork, Waterford and Limerick had created new centres of wealth and military power that operated outside traditional Irish political structures. These towns controlled trade networks that generated unprecedented concentrations of silver, exotic goods and military resources. Brian understood that any Irish ruler seeking to establish authority over the entire island would need to either destroy these settlements or harness their economic and military potential. Brian's early military innovations included the development of naval forces capable of challenging Viking control of Irish waters and the creation of professional military units that could match Viking tactical effectiveness. His approach to dealing with Vikings combined military pressure with diplomatic negotiation, recognizing that complete expulsion was neither possible nor necessarily desirable. His campaigns against the Dublin Vikings during the 990s aimed not at destroying the settlement, but at establishing Irish supremacy over Viking political and military activities. The Siege of Dublin in 999 AD represented the culmination of Brian's efforts to establish Irish supremacy while maintaining Viking economic and military value. The resolution through negotiation rather than assault reflected Brian's sophisticated understanding of the benefits Viking settlements could provide. The agreement required the Dublin Vikings to acknowledge Brian's authority and provide military service when requested, while allowing them to maintain their commercial activities and internal governance structures. Brian's assumption of the title High King of Ireland around 1002 marked a fundamental transformation in Irish political authority. Previous holders of the title had exercised largely ceremonial supremacy based on ritual recognition at Tara. Brian's high kingship involved direct administrative control over subordinate territories, systematic extraction of tribute and military service, and the maintenance of professional military forces capable of enforcing royal authority throughout the island. But not everyone accepted Brian's supremacy. Mael Morda mac Murchada, King of Leinster, resented Brian's expansion of royal authority into his traditional territories. Sigtryg Silkbeard, the Viking ruler of Dublin, maintained his own ambitions for independence, and these two men would form a coalition that would challenge Brian at Clontarf. April 23, 1014, Good Friday. The armies assembled on the plains north of Dublin. Brian's forces included warriors from Munster, Connaught, and other Irish kingdoms that acknowledged his authority, supported by contingents of Viking allies who had accepted Irish overlordship. The opposing coalition combined Dublin Vikings with warriors from the Isle of Man, the Orkneys, and possibly Iceland. This wasn't just an Irish battle, this was an international conflict that would determine the future of the entire island. The Battle of Clontarf unfolded as a day-long struggle between forces that were roughly equal in size but differed significantly in composition and tactical approaches. Brian's forces relied heavily on traditional Irish infantry tactics, with warriors fighting in loose formations that emphasized individual combat skills and personal loyalty to their leaders. The Viking forces employed more disciplined formations, including the famous shield wall that had proven effective in battles throughout the Viking world. The fighting was particularly fierce around the Dublin forces, where Sigtryg's warriors fought to maintain their independence against Irish domination. As the sun climbed higher, Brian's forces began to gain the upper hand. The Vikings' shield wall began to break. Warriors who had sailed from Orkney and the Isle of Man to support Dublin's independence found themselves pushed back toward the sea. Some drowned trying to reach their ships. Others were cut down as they fled. By afternoon, it was clear that Brian had won a decisive victory. The Viking threat to Irish independence had been broken. Dublin would remain under Irish control. But then came the tragedy that would transform victory into catastrophe. Brian Boru, now 73 years old, had remained in his tent throughout the battle, reportedly praying for his forces. According to tradition, fleeing Vikings discovered the tent and killed the elderly king before his guards could intervene. The death of Brian Boru during the battle transformed a tactical victory into a strategic setback for Irish forces. Brian's death removed the one leader who had successfully united much of Ireland under a single authority, leading to the fragmentation of his coalition and the resumption of traditional Irish political divisions. The Dublin Vikings, despite their defeat at Clontarf, retained control of their settlement and continued to play important roles in Irish politics and commerce. The battle's outcome demonstrated that Vikings had become integrated into Irish society during 2 centuries of settlement and interaction. Many Viking warriors captured during the battle were ransomed back to their communities rather than executed, indicating that they were regarded as fellow inhabitants of Ireland rather than foreign enemies. The gradual integration of Viking settlers into Irish society occurred through multiple mechanisms that transformed both communities while preserving distinct cultural elements. Intermarriage between Viking men and Irish women created families with connections to both communities, producing children who served as cultural intermediaries and political brokers. The conversion of Viking settlers to Christianity represented another crucial element in their integration. The process was gradual and often incomplete, with many Vikings maintaining elements of their traditional religious practices while adopting Christian beliefs and customs. By the 11th century, the Norse Irish had become a distinct community, neither fully Viking nor fully Irish, but something new. They spoke both languages, practiced Irish customs alongside Scandinavian traditions, and participated fully in both Irish politics and Scandinavian trade networks. The Viking Age in Ireland was ending, but its legacy would last forever. In the cities they founded, in the trade networks they established, in the families that descended from Viking Irish marriages, Ireland had absorbed its invaders. But the political fragmentation that followed Brian Boru's death would have terrible consequences, because when the next invaders came, Ireland would be too divided to resist. The death of Brian Boru left Ireland politically fragmented, with no single ruler capable of maintaining the centralized authority he had established. By the mid-12th century, Ireland remained divided among numerous competing kingdoms, each pursuing their own territorial ambitions, while the Viking settlements continued to function as semi-independent commercial centres. This political fragmentation created a landscape of constantly shifting alliances where local kings competed for supremacy, while maintaining complex relationships with Norse-Irish towns that controlled crucial trade networks. The High Kingship became a contested title, with various dynasties claiming supremacy based on military success and ritual recognition rather than administrative control. The Uí Néill in the north, the Uí Briain in Munster, the Uí Conchobar in Connaught, each maintained their own spheres of influence while acknowledging no permanent superior authority. This system worked adequately for managing traditional Irish conflicts, but it created fatal vulnerabilities when confronted with external threats that required coordinated resistance. The weakness of this fragmented system became catastrophically apparent through a single act of passion or perhaps political calculation that would change Irish history forever. In 1152, Diarmait mac Murchada, King of Leinster, forcibly abducted Derb Forgail, the wife of Tiganan wa Ruairc, King of Breifne. This wasn't a romantic elopement. Derb Forgail was considerably older than Diarmait, and the abduction violated fundamental principles of Irish law and custom. The incident demonstrated Diarmait's willingness to flout traditional Irish social norms in pursuit of political advantage, insulting a rival king while asserting his own power. Tiganan wa Ruairc's response involved forming a coalition with Ruaidrí Ua Conchobar, the High King of Ireland, and other Irish rulers who viewed Diarmait's behaviour as a threat to established social order. The coalition's military campaigns against Leinster during the 1150s systematically dismantled Diarmait's power base, capturing his strongholds and driving his supporters into exile or submission. By 1166, Diarmait had been forced to flee Ireland entirely, seeking refuge first in Bristol and then at the court of Henry II of England. His departure appeared to resolve the succession crisis in favour of his enemies. But Diarmait's exile would ultimately prove far more dangerous to Irish independence than his continued presence in Leinster. Because Diarmait mac Murchada was about to make a deal that would bring a new kind of invader to Ireland, warriors with superior military technology, systematic conquest strategies, and no respect for Irish political traditions. The Normans were coming, and unlike the Vikings, they wouldn't just settle on the coasts, they would try to conquer everything. Diarmait's appeal to Henry II for military assistance coincided with the English king's broader imperial ambitions, which encompassed not only his inherited territories in England and Normandy, but also his acquired domains in Aquitaine and his recent conquests in Wales. Henry's court included numerous Anglo-Norman lords who had participated in the conquest of Wales and were eager for new opportunities to acquire land and wealth through military service. These men possessed military experience, advanced weaponry, and organizational skills that far exceeded those available to Irish rulers. The papal bull Laudabilita, allegedly issued by Pope Adrian IV around 1155, provided Henry II with ecclesiastical justification for intervening in Irish affairs. The document purported to grant Henry authority to invade Ireland for the purpose of reforming the Irish Church and bringing it into closer conformity with Roman practices. Modern historians debate its authenticity, but regardless, it served Henry's political purposes by providing religious legitimacy for what was essentially conquest motivated by territorial ambition. Henry's initial response to Diarmait's request was cautious. Instead of committing royal forces, Henry issued letters patent that authorized any of his subjects to assist the exiled Irish king in recovering his kingdom. This approach allowed Henry to maintain plausible deniability while enabling ambitious Anglo-Norman lords to pursue their own interests in Ireland. Richard de Clare, Earl of Pembroke, known as Strongbow, emerged as the most significant figure among the Anglo-Norman lords who responded to Diarmait's appeal. Strongbow's position in Wales had been weakened by Henry II's policies of royal centralization. His financial difficulties and political marginalization made him receptive to opportunities for recovering his fortunes through foreign adventure. Diarmait's offer to grant him the hand of his daughter, Ioffa, in marriage, along with succession to the Kingdom of Leinster, provided incentives that outweighed the considerable risks. This agreement represented a fundamental departure from traditional Irish political practices, which did not recognize the principle of inheritance through marriage to foreign princes. Irish kingship was elective within royal lineages, with succession determined by the support of noble families. Diarmait's promise to transfer his kingdom to a foreign son-in-law violated these customs while demonstrating his willingness to sacrifice Irish political traditions for personal advantage. The arrangement established precedents that would facilitate subsequent Anglo-Norman expansion throughout Ireland. The preliminary Anglo-Norman expeditions to Ireland began in 1169 with the arrival of Robert Fitzstephen and Maurice de Prendergast, who landed at Bannow Bay in County Wexford with approximately 300 men-at-arms and archers. These forces represented the advance guard tasked with establishing secure bases before the arrival of more substantial reinforcements. The composition of these early expeditions reflected the international character of Anglo-Norman warfare, including Norman knights, English men-at-arms, and Welsh archers, whose skills with the longbow had proven decisive in recent campaigns in Wales. The Irish were about to discover that their traditional military methods were no match for this new enemy. The military technology that Anglo-Norman forces brought to Ireland represented significant advances over traditional Irish warfare methods. Norman knights fought as heavy cavalry, wearing mail hauberks that provided protection against Irish weapons while wielding lances, swords, and maces that could penetrate Irish armour. Their horses were larger and better trained than those used by Irish warriors, providing advantages in both mounted combat and battlefield mobility. Anglo-Norman infantry included crossbowmen whose mechanical weapons could penetrate armour at greater ranges than traditional Irish javelins or slings, while Welsh longbowmen provided rapid-fire capabilities that could disrupt Irish formations before they reached close combat range. The tactical innovations that Anglo-Norman forces employed proved equally important in establishing their military superiority. Norman knights fought in coordinated formations that maximized the impact of cavalry charges while providing mutual support against infantry attacks. Their infantry operated in disciplined units that could maintain formation under pressure, using overlapping shields and coordinated spearwork to create defensive barriers that Irish warriors found difficult to penetrate. The combination of heavy cavalry, disciplined infantry, and effective missile troops created tactical systems that had proven successful throughout the Norman conquests in England, Sicily, and the Crusader states. The Battle of Killistown in 1169 demonstrated the tactical advantages that Anglo-Norman forces possessed over traditional Irish armies. And the engagement arose when Irish forces under the command of local Leinster nobles attempted to prevent Fitzstephen's men from establishing a permanent base near Wexford. The Irish attack employed traditional tactics, with warriors advancing in loose formations while hurling javelins and engaging in individual combat with Anglo-Norman defenders. The Norman response combined disciplined infantry defence with coordinated cavalry charges that broke Irish formations and forced their retreat. The battle's outcome established patterns that would characterise Anglo-Norman conquest throughout Ireland. The Siege of Wexford in 1169 showcased Anglo-Norman expertise in siege warfare, an area where they possessed decisive advantages over Irish defenders. The town's fortifications, built by Viking settlers during the previous century, included earthwork ramparts and timber palisades that provided protection against traditional Irish assault methods. However, these defences proved inadequate against Anglo-Norman siege techniques, which included the construction of specialised siege engines the systematic undermining of defensive walls, and the coordination of land and sea attacks that prevented the escape or reinforcement of defenders. Strongbow's arrival in Ireland in August 1170 with a force of approximately 1,000 men marked the beginning of large-scale Anglo-Norman conquest operations. The Earl's expedition included not only military forces but also administrators, craftsmen and settlers who were prepared to establish permanent Anglo-Norman control over conquered territories. This approach differed fundamentally from traditional Irish warfare, which focused on extracting tribute and establishing temporary supremacy rather than permanent occupation and colonization. Strongbow's methods reflected Norman experience in England and Sicily, where systematic conquest had been followed by comprehensive administrative and social transformation. The siege was coming for Ireland's most important city, and Dublin was about to fall. The Siege of Waterford in August 1170 demonstrated the effectiveness of combined Anglo-Norman operations that coordinated land and sea forces in systematic assault on fortified positions. The town's location on the River Suir provided natural defensive advantages, while its Viking-built fortifications included stone walls and towers that represented some of the strongest defences in Ireland. Strongbow's forces employed sophisticated siege techniques, as including the construction of siege towers, the use of battering rams, and coordinated assaults that overwhelmed defenders through superior organisation and equipment. The fall of Waterford provided Anglo-Norman forces with a secure base for further operations, while demonstrating their ability to capture even the strongest Irish fortifications. The marriage of Strongbow to Aoife, Diarmait mac Murchada's daughter, took place in Waterford immediately after the town's capture, symbolising the union of Anglo-Norman military power with Irish political legitimacy. The ceremony combined Norman and Irish customs, reflecting the hybrid character that Anglo-Norman rule would assume in Ireland. However, the marriage also represented the subordination of Irish political traditions to foreign conquest, as Aoife's inheritance rights were defined according to Anglo-Norman rather than Irish legal principles. The conquest of Dublin in September 1170 represented the most significant Anglo-Norman victory in Ireland, providing them with control over the island's most important commercial and political centre. The city's capture required careful planning and coordination between Strongbow's forces and those of Diarmait mac Murchada, who provided local knowledge and Irish allies for the operation. The assault combined traditional siege techniques with innovative tactics adapted to Dublin's specific defensive characteristics, including its position on the Liffey River and its combination of Viking-era fortifications with more recent Irish additions. The defence of Dublin was organised by Ascall mac Ragnall, the city's Norse-Irish ruler, who commanded a mixed force of Viking settlers, Irish allies, and foreign mercenaries recruited from throughout the Scandinavian world. The defenders employed both traditional Viking tactics and innovations adapted from their experience fighting Irish armies, including the use of coordinated shipborne attacks and defensive strategies that maximized the advantages provided by the city's fortifications. However, these methods proved inadequate against the systematic assault techniques that Anglo-Norman forces had perfected during their conquests in Wales and England. The fall of Dublin created panic throughout Ireland as rulers recognized that Anglo-Norman forces possessed capabilities that exceeded anything previously seen in Irish warfare. The city's capture provided the invaders with access to extensive trade networks, substantial financial resources, and strategic control over Eastern Ireland's communications and transportation systems. More importantly, Dublin's fall demonstrated that no Irish fortification, regardless of its strength or strategic importance, could withstand systematic Anglo-Norman assault supported by adequate resources and professional military leadership. But the conquest was about to become a royal project because Henry II had been watching from England, and he was deeply concerned that Strongbow and other Anglo-Norman lords might establish independent principalities in Ireland that would challenge royal authority. The king was coming to Ireland, and his arrival would transform everything. Henry II's arrival in Ireland in October 1171 with a massive royal army of approximately 4,000 men transformed the Anglo-Norman intervention from a private expedition into a systematic royal conquest. The king's decision to intervene directly reflected his concern that Strongbow and other Anglo-Norman lords might establish independent principalities in Ireland that would challenge royal authority. Henry's expedition included not only military forces but also administrative personnel, legal experts, and ecclesiastical officials who were prepared to establish comprehensive English governmental systems throughout conquered Irish territories. The submission of Irish kings to Henry II at Dublin during the winter of 1171 to 1172 represented a fundamental transformation in Irish political structures. Rulers who had maintained independence for centuries, including Diarmaid mac Carthaig of Desmond, Donald Mór Ua Briain of Thomond, and numerous lesser kings, formally acknowledged Henry's supremacy and agreed to hold their territories as feudal fiefs under English law. These submissions were motivated partly by fear of Anglo-Norman military power and partly by calculations that cooperation with the invaders might preserve some degree of local authority under new political arrangements. The establishment of Anglo-Norman administrative systems in Ireland began immediately following Henry II's arrival, with English officials implementing governmental structures that had proven effective in England and Normandy. The introduction of the office of justiciar provided centralized royal authority over all English territories in Ireland, while the appointment of sheriffs in conquered counties created local administrative systems that could collect taxes, maintain order, and implement royal policies. These innovations represented fundamental departures from Irish political traditions, which had never developed centralized governmental institutions comparable to those that characterized Anglo-Norman administration. The implementation of feudalism in Ireland involved the systematic redistribution of land from Irish owners to Anglo-Norman settlers according to principles of military tenure that bound landholders to provide specified military services in exchange for their estates. This system created hierarchical relationships between the king, his tenants-in-chief, and their subtenants that provided mechanisms for military recruitment, tax collection, and political control that were far more systematic than anything that had existed in pre-conquest Ireland. The feudal system also introduced concepts of written documentation, formal legal procedures, and standardized obligations that transformed the basis of landholding throughout Anglo-Norman territories. The introduction of English common law alongside existing Irish legal traditions created complex jurisdictional arrangements that reflected the hybrid character of Anglo-Norman rule in Ireland. English settlers were generally subject to English law administered by English officials, while Irish inhabitants of conquered territories often retained access to traditional Brehon law for certain types of disputes. This legal pluralism created opportunities for forum shopping and jurisdictional conflicts, but it also provided mechanisms for accommodating different cultural traditions within a unified political system. The founding of Anglo-Norman towns represented one of the most visible transformations of the Irish landscape. New Ross, founded around 1200 at the confluence of the Nore and Barrow rivers, was a planned community that incorporated advanced urban design principles developed in England and continental Europe. But Ireland was being partitioned. The Normans controlled the east and parts of the south, but Ulster, Connaught, and Western Ireland remained defiantly Gaelic. The partition of Ireland that emerged during the late 12th and early 13th centuries reflected the practical limitations of Anglo-Norman military power rather than any deliberate policy of partial conquest. The invaders achieved their most complete success in Leinster, where Strongbow's marriage to Alwife had provided legal justification for territorial claims that were then enforced through systematic military occupation. The rich agricultural lands of eastern Leinster, with their established settlements and productive farms, offered immediate economic rewards that justified the substantial investments required for conquest and colonisation. East Munster similarly fell under Anglo-Norman control through a combination of military conquest and strategic marriage alliances. The invasion of Cork in 1177 by Robert Fitzstephen and Miles de Cogan established Anglo-Norman authority over the region's most important commercial centre, while systematic campaigns during the following decades extended foreign control throughout the fertile river valleys. The construction of stone castles throughout conquered territories provided Anglo-Norman settlers with secure bases for maintaining control while demonstrating the permanence of their occupation. Trim Castle, begun around 1176 by Hugh de Lacy, exemplified the sophisticated military architecture that Anglo-Norman builders brought to Ireland. The castle's massive rectangular keep, rising over 75 feet above the River Boyne, incorporated advanced defensive features including arrow loops positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire, murder holes that allowed defenders to attack besiegers within the gatehouse, and thick walls capable of withstanding the most powerful siege engines available to medieval armies. Kilkenny Castle, established by William Marshall around 1195, controlled a strategic crossing of the River Nore while serving as the administrative centre for extensive lands granted to Marshall by King John. But the territories that remained under independent Irish control presented formidable obstacles to Anglo-Norman expansion that would persist throughout the medieval period. Ulster's landscape of mountains, forests and bogs provided natural defensive advantages that favoured Irish military tactics while hindering the deployment of Anglo-Norman heavy cavalry. The region's Gaelic lords, particularly the O'Neills and O'Donnells, maintained traditional military systems that emphasised mobility, local knowledge and guerrilla tactics that proved highly effective against foreign invaders operating in unfamiliar terrain. Connacht's political unity under the Ua-Conchobar dynasty provided another significant barrier to Anglo-Norman expansion. Ruaidrí Ua-Conchobar, the last recognised High King of Ireland, had established administrative systems that combined traditional Irish political structures with innovations adapted from contact with Anglo-Norman territories. His successors maintained effective resistance to foreign encroachment while developing diplomatic relationships with Anglo-Norman lords that sometimes involved temporary alliances against common enemies. The emergence of great Anglo-Norman families during the late 12th and early 13th centuries created new forms of aristocratic power that would dominate Irish politics for centuries. The Fitzgeralds established themselves as one of the most powerful Anglo-Norman dynasties through their acquisition of extensive territories in Kildare, Desmond, and other strategic locations. Maurice Fitzgerald, who had participated in the initial invasion alongside Strongbow, received substantial land grants that formed the foundation for his family's subsequent expansion. His descendants would develop into two major branches: the Earls of Kildare, who controlled territories in the Eastern Midlands, and the Earls of Desmond, whose lands encompassed much of southwestern Ireland. But something strange was happening to these Norman conquerors. They were becoming Irish. And the process of cultural adaptation that characterized Anglo-Norman settlement in Ireland occurred gradually through daily interactions between foreign settlers and Irish populations that created hybrid communities combining elements from both traditions. Anglo-Norman manor houses often employed Irish servants, craftsmen, and agricultural workers who brought traditional skills and knowledge to their new employers. Irish women who married Anglo-Norman men introduced Gaelic customs into settler households, while Irish foster practices created personal relationships that transcended ethnic boundaries. The development of Anglo-Norman towns throughout conquered territories created new forms of urban life that combined English municipal traditions with Irish commercial practices. Kilkenny emerged as a major Anglo-Norman urban centre through its strategic location on the River Nore and its role as the administrative centre for William Marshall's extensive Irish territories. The town's development included the construction of St. Canice's Cathedral, which combined Anglo-Norman architectural styles with Irish building techniques and decorative traditions. The cathedral's construction required collaboration between foreign and Irish craftsmen who contributed different skills and artistic traditions to create a structure that reflected the cultural synthesis characterizing Anglo-Norman Ireland. The Catholic Church played a crucial role in facilitating the integration of Anglo-Norman and Irish populations, while serving as a unifying force that transcended ethnic and political divisions. The Church's universal character provided common ground for foreign settlers and Irish inhabitants who shared fundamental Christian beliefs despite their cultural differences. Anglo-Norman religious foundations often incorporated existing Irish monastic communities, creating institutional continuity that eased the transition to foreign rule while preserving important elements of Irish ecclesiastical tradition. The establishment of new religious orders in Anglo-Norman territories introduced continental European monastic practices that enriched Irish spiritual life while creating international connections that facilitated cultural exchange. The Cistercians, who established their first Irish house at Mellifont in 1142, experienced rapid expansion during the Anglo-Norman period as both foreign and Irish patrons provided generous endowments for new foundations. Cistercian monasteries like Jerpoint, founded around 1180, combined the order's emphasis on agricultural improvement and technological innovation with Irish traditions of learning and artistic achievement. But by the 14th century, a crisis was emerging. The Black Death was coming to Europe, and when it reached Ireland in 1348, it would hit the Norman settlers far harder than the Gaelic Irish because concentrated urban populations were perfect vectors for plague transmission. The demographic catastrophe that followed would fundamentally alter the balance of power in Ireland. The Normans, who had seemed unstoppable, would find themselves retreating. The Gaelic Irish would begin reclaiming their lands, and a new phrase would enter the English vocabulary to describe what was happening to the Norman families: more Irish than the Irish themselves. The process of Hibernicization, Normans becoming Irish, was accelerating. The Fitzgeralds were becoming Gearoid, the Daybergs were becoming Burke. They were speaking Irish, following Irish laws, marrying according to Irish customs, fostering their children with Irish families. The conquest was being reversed, not through military defeat, but through cultural assimilation. But the crisis would intensify when Scotland intervened in Irish affairs, and the arrival of Edward Bruce with a Scottish army would demonstrate just how vulnerable Norman authority had become. The Bruce invasion of 1315 to 1318 represented a crucial external intervention that profoundly affected the balance of power between Gaelic and Anglo-Norman communities throughout Ireland. Edward Bruce's arrival in Ireland with a Scottish army of approximately 6,000 men provided Gaelic rulers with unprecedented military support for their resistance to English authority, while creating opportunities for coordinated Celtic opposition to Anglo-Norman rule. The invasion's timing coincided with English military commitments in Scotland and France that limited the resources available for defending Irish territories against this new threat. Edward Bruce's claim to the kingship of Ireland, supported by his brother Robert, Bruce's victory over English forces at Bannockburn in 1314, challenged fundamental assumptions about English sovereignty over Irish territories while providing Gaelic rulers with an alternative focus for political loyalty. The Scottish intervention transformed local Irish conflicts into components of a broader Celtic resistance movement that connected Irish political struggles with Scottish independence efforts and Welsh opposition to English expansion. The military campaigns that accompanied the Bruce invasion demonstrated both the potential and limitations of Celtic military cooperation against Anglo-Norman authority. Edward Bruce's forces achieved significant initial successes, capturing Carrickfergus Castle and establishing control over substantial territories in Ulster, while Irish allies provided local knowledge and additional manpower that enhanced Scottish military capabilities. The combined Celtic forces employed innovative tactical approaches that maximised their advantages in mobility and local knowledge while avoiding direct confrontations with Anglo-Norman armies in circumstances that favoured foreign military technologies. The Battle of Faughart in 1318, where Edward Bruce was killed while leading a final assault against Anglo-Norman forces, marked the end of the most serious external challenge to colonial authority since the initial conquest. The battle's outcome temporarily restored Anglo-Norman confidence while eliminating the foreign military support that had enabled Gaelic resistance to achieve unprecedented success during the previous 3 years. Nevertheless, the invasion had demonstrated the vulnerability of colonial authority to external intervention while strengthening Gaelic political consciousness and military capabilities that would influence Irish resistance movements for decades. The arrival of the Black Death in Ireland during 1348 created demographic and economic disruptions that profoundly altered the balance of power between different communities throughout the island. The plague's initial impact fell most heavily on the Anglo-Norman towns and settled areas where concentrated populations and international trade connections facilitated the rapid spread of disease. Dublin, Cork, Waterford, and other colonial centres experienced devastating mortality rates that eliminated substantial portions of their populations while disrupting the commercial and administrative activities that supported Anglo-Norman authority. The differential impact of plague mortality between Anglo-Norman and Gaelic communities reflected different settlement patterns and economic relationships that characterized their respective societies. Anglo-Norman territories, with their emphasis on intensive agriculture, concentrated settlements, and international trade, provided ideal conditions for plague transmission, while Gaelic areas characterized by dispersed populations, pastoral agriculture, and limited external contacts experienced less severe demographic losses. As this disparity created opportunities for Gaelic expansion into territories that had been depopulated by plague while weakening the demographic foundations of colonial authority. The English government's response to this crisis revealed how desperately they wanted to stop the Normans from becoming Irish, and in 1366 they would pass legislation that tried to criminalise Irish culture itself. The Statutes of Kilkenny, enacted by the Irish Parliament in 1366 during the justiciarship of Lionel of Antwerp, represented the English government's most systematic attempt to address the crisis of colonial authority through legislative measures designed to prevent the continued assimilation of Anglo-Norman settlers into Irish society. The statutes reflected deep concern among English officials about the extent to which descendants of the original conquerors had adopted Irish customs, language, and social practices in ways that compromised their loyalty to English interests. The legislation's 36 clauses addressed virtually every aspect of cultural interaction between Anglo-Norman and Irish communities, creating a comprehensive legal framework intended to maintain ethnic separation and colonial identity. The prohibition against Anglo-Norman adoption of Irish names represented one of the most significant provisions of the Kilkenny legislation, reflecting official recognition that cultural assimilation had proceeded so far that many colonial families could no longer be distinguished from their Irish neighbours. Families like the de Burghs, who had become Burke in Irish usage, and the Fitzgeralds, known as MacGearailt in Gaelic territories, had adopted Irish naming conventions that reflected their integration into Irish society. The statutes required these families to resume their original Norman names while forbidding future adoption of Irish nomenclature, demonstrating the extent to which language had become a marker of political loyalty in medieval Ireland. The ban on Irish dress and hairstyles among Anglo-Norman populations indicated how thoroughly visual markers of cultural identity had been transformed through daily interaction between colonial and indigenous communities. Anglo-Norman men had begun wearing the distinctive Irish mantle, a woolen cloak that provided practical advantages in Ireland's climate while marking its wearer as culturally Irish rather than English. Similarly, the adoption of Irish hairstyles, including the glib or long fringe that characterized traditional Irish grooming, had become widespread among colonial populations despite its association with Gaelic cultural identity. The prohibition against Irish marriage customs addressed what English officials regarded as one of the most dangerous aspects of cultural assimilation, as Anglo-Norman families had increasingly adopted Irish practices, including temporary marriage, divorce, and inheritance patterns that differed fundamentally from English legal traditions. Irish marriage law, based on Brehon legal principles, recognized various forms of union that provided greater flexibility than canonical marriage while accommodating the political and economic needs of aristocratic families. Anglo-Norman adoption of these practices had created complex legal situations where inheritance rights, political alliances, and family relationships operated according to Irish rather than English principles. The ban on fostering relationships between Anglo-Norman and Irish families represented perhaps the most significant challenge to established social practices, as fosterage had become deeply embedded in colonial society as a means of creating personal relationships that transcended ethnic boundaries. Anglo-Norman families had discovered that fostering their children in Irish households provided practical advantages in governing mixed populations while creating personal loyalties that enhanced political stability. The requirement that Anglo-Norman populations use only English or French in their daily communications reflected the extent to which Irish had become the dominant language in many colonial territories. The effectiveness of the Kilkenny legislation proved limited from its inception, as the practical circumstances that had driven cultural assimilation continued to operate despite legal prohibitions. Many provisions were simply ignored by Anglo-Norman families who found that compliance would compromise their ability to govern their territories effectively. The Normans were becoming Irish, and nothing could stop it. The rise of the Fitzgerald family as a dominant force in Irish politics during the 14th century exemplified the complex relationship between Anglo-Norman identity and Irish political realities. The family's two main branches, centred at Kildare and Desmond, had developed different strategies for maintaining their power and influence in response to the changing political landscape of medieval Ireland. The Kildare Fitzgeralds, whose territories lay closer to Dublin and the centre of colonial administration, maintained stronger connections with English political traditions while adapting their practices to accommodate Irish social customs. The Desmond Fitzgeralds, operating in the more thoroughly Gaelicised environment of southwestern Ireland, adopted Irish customs more completely while maintaining nominal loyalty to English authority. Gerald Fitzgerald, the third Earl of Desmond, demonstrated the sophisticated political balancing act required of Anglo-Norman lords operating in heavily Irish territories during the mid-14th century. His administration of extensive territories in Cork, Kerry, and Limerick required constant negotiation with Gaelic lords who controlled neighbouring territories while maintaining relationships with English officials who expected loyalty and military service. Gerald's court at Askeaton combined Anglo-Norman administrative practices with Irish cultural traditions, creating a hybrid political system that drew legitimacy from both colonial and indigenous sources of authority. The Earl's adoption of Irish legal practices in governing his territories reflected practical recognition that Brehon law often provided more effective mechanisms for resolving disputes and maintaining social order than English common law in areas where royal administrative institutions remained weak. His courts employed Irish legal scholars alongside English-trained administrators, creating judicial systems that could address the diverse legal traditions present within his territories. This legal pluralism enabled the Earl to maintain authority over mixed populations while avoiding the conflicts that would have resulted from attempts to impose uniform legal systems on culturally diverse communities. and the development of a distinctive Anglo-Irish identity during the 14th century reflected the gradual emergence of communities that combined elements from both English and Irish traditions, while developing characteristics that were unique to their particular historical circumstances. These communities spoke Irish as their primary language, while maintaining knowledge of English for official purposes, practiced Irish customs in their daily lives while observing English legal forms in their public activities, and maintained loyalty to English political authority while participating fully in Irish cultural life. This hybrid identity enabled Anglo-Norman families to function effectively in Irish society while preserving their claims to English political support and legal privileges. The construction of tower houses throughout Anglo-Norman territories during the late 14th and early 15th centuries created a new architectural form that responded specifically to Irish political and social conditions. These structures, typically rising 4 or 5 stories and measuring approximately 40 by 30 feet at their base, provided secure residential facilities for Anglo-Norman families while requiring fewer resources for construction and maintenance than traditional castles. The tower house design accommodated Irish social customs, including large household gatherings, while providing defensive capabilities adequate for the localized conflicts that characterized Irish warfare during this period. By 1400, the political landscape of Ireland had been transformed almost beyond recognition. The Pale, the small fortified zone around Dublin, represented the last area of direct English control. Beyond it lay a complex patchwork of territories, Gaelicized Anglo-Norman lordships that were Irish in everything but name, independent Gaelic kingdoms that had never submitted to English authority, and hybrid communities that existed somewhere between. The Tudor monarchs were about to decide this situation was unacceptable, and they would spend the next 2 centuries trying to complete the conquest that the Normans had begun but failed to finish. The death of Richard II in 1400 and the subsequent Lancastrian usurpation fundamentally altered the relationship between England and Ireland, creating political uncertainties that would reverberate throughout the 15th century. Henry IV's precarious hold on the English throne meant that Ireland, already peripheral to royal concerns, received even less attention from Westminster as the new king focused on consolidating his authority against domestic challenges and Scottish threats. This neglect created opportunities for both Gaelic Irish lords and Anglo-Irish families to expand their autonomy, while the colonial administration in Dublin struggled to maintain effective control over territories that had been securely held for centuries. The practical consequences of reduced English oversight became immediately apparent in the steady contraction of the Pale, the fortified zone around Dublin that represented the last bastion of direct royal control in Ireland. By 1400, this area encompassed only portions of modern counties Dublin, Meath, Louth, and Kildare, a dramatic reduction from the extensive territories that had acknowledged English authority during the 13th century. The boundaries of the Pale required constant defence against incursions by Gaelic Irish clans, particularly the O'Byrnes and O'Tooles from the Wicklow Mountains, who conducted regular cattle raids that demonstrated the weakness of colonial military forces. Within this contracted zone of English control, the great Anglo-Irish families emerged as the dominant political force, wielding authority that often exceeded that of royal officials appointed from England. The Butlers, Fitzgeralds, and other established families possessed extensive landholdings, private armies, and local knowledge that made them indispensable to any effective governance of Ireland. Their power rested on complex networks of kinship, clientage, and military alliance that operated according to Irish rather than English political principles, creating hybrid governmental systems that combined feudal obligations with Gaelic social structures. The rise of these Anglo-Irish magnates coincided with the outbreak of the Wars of the Roses in England, a prolonged dynastic conflict that would profoundly affect Irish politics throughout the latter half of the 15th century. The competing claims of the houses of Lancaster and York for the English throne created opportunities for Irish families to choose sides based on their own political interests rather than abstract loyalty to royal authority. The Fitzgeralds of Kildare generally supported the Yorkist cause, calculating that their geographic position near Dublin made them natural allies of any faction that controlled the English government. The Butlers of Ormond, whose territories lay further from the colonial centre, maintained more flexible allegiances that allowed them to negotiate with both Lancastrian and Yorkist representatives depending on changing political circumstances. Garrett Moore Fitzgerald, 8th Earl of Kildare, emerged during the 1470s as the most powerful individual in Ireland, wielding authority that extended far beyond his official position as Lord Deputy to encompass virtually autonomous control over Irish affairs. His appointment to the deputyship in 1478 marked the beginning of a remarkable career that would span nearly 4 decades and establish patterns of Anglo-Irish autonomy that would persist into the Tudor period. The Earl's power base combined traditional feudal resources with innovations adapted to Irish political conditions. His territories in Kildare provided substantial agricultural revenues and strategic control over the approaches to Dublin, while his network of castles and tower houses created a defensive system that could project military force throughout the Eastern Midlands. But this Anglo-Irish autonomy would not last. The Tudor dynasty was coming, and they would have very different ideas about how Ireland should be governed. The accession of Henry VII to the English throne, following his victory at Bosworth Field in 1485, marked the beginning of a new era in Anglo-Irish relations that would fundamentally transform the political landscape of Ireland. The first Tudor monarch inherited a kingdom exhausted by decades of civil war and an Irish lordship that had operated with virtual independence under powerful Anglo-Irish magnates. Henry's approach to Irish governance reflected his broader political strategy of centralizing royal authority while eliminating potential threats to his precarious dynasty. The king understood that the great Anglo-Irish families, particularly the Fitzgeralds of Kildare, possessed the military resources and political networks necessary to support pretenders to the English throne, making their control essential for Tudor security. The immediate challenge facing Henry VII in Ireland centred on Garrett Moore Fitzgerald's support for Lambert Simnel's claim to the English throne in 1487. The Earl of Kildare's decision to back the Yorkist pretender reflected his calculation that a successful restoration would preserve the favourable political arrangements that had characterised Edward VI's reign. Simnel's coronation as Edward VI in Christchurch Cathedral, Dublin, demonstrated the extent of Anglo-Irish autonomy while revealing the symbolic importance that traditional ceremonies retained in legitimising political authority. The military forces that Garrett Moore assembled to support Simnel's invasion of England in 1487 revealed the sophisticated military capabilities that Anglo-Irish magnates had developed during the 15th century. The Earl's army included approximately 4,500 Irish troops, comprising both his own feudal levies and allied forces provided by Gaelic lords who shared his opposition to Tudor authority. The defeat of Simnel's forces at the Battle of Stoke Field forced Garrett Moore to negotiate his submission to Henry VII, but the terms of his eventual reconciliation demonstrated the practical limitations of Tudor authority in Ireland. The Earl's pardon in 1488 acknowledged his essential role in Irish governance while establishing precedents for the complex relationship between Tudor monarchs and Anglo-Irish magnates that would characterise the following decades. Henry VII's pragmatic acceptance of Garrett Moore's continued dominance reflected recognition that effective control of Ireland required the cooperation of established Anglo-Irish families rather than their replacement by English-appointed officials. The enactment of Poynings Law in 1495, during the deputyship of Sir Edward Poynings, represented Henry VII's systematic attempt to establish English parliamentary supremacy over Irish legislative processes. The law required that all proposed Irish legislation receive prior approval from the English King and Council before being submitted to the Irish Parliament, effectively subordinating Irish governmental autonomy to English oversight. Additionally, the legislation declared that all existing English statutes automatically applied to Ireland, creating uniform legal frameworks that eliminated the jurisdictional complexities that had characterized medieval Irish governance. The practical implementation of Poynings's law proved more complex than its theoretical framework suggested, as the legislation required administrative resources and political will that were often unavailable in the fragmented political landscape of early Tudor Ireland. English officials lacked the detailed knowledge of Irish conditions necessary to evaluate proposed legislation effectively, while the time delays inherent in the approval process often made parliamentary responses to immediate crises impossible. But the Tudors were patient. They were building the administrative machinery that would eventually enable complete conquest. And under Henry VIII, the pressure would intensify dramatically. The accession of Henry VIII in 1509 brought to the English throne a monarch whose approach to Irish affairs differed fundamentally from his father's pragmatic accommodation with existing power structures. The young king's aggressive pursuit of royal supremacy in religious and political matters created new pressures on Anglo-Irish families who had maintained their authority through careful balance between English loyalty and Irish political necessities. Henry VIII's broader European ambitions and his conflicts with continental powers also increased the strategic importance of Ireland as a potential base for foreign intervention against English interests. The Kildare Rebellion of 1534 to 1535 arose from the intersection of these broader political developments with specific Irish circumstances. The rebellion began when Silken Thomas Fitzgerald, acting as deputy for his father Garetog, the 9th Earl of Kildare, received reports that his father had been executed in the Tower of London. Although these reports proved false, Thomas's dramatic renunciation of his allegiance to Henry VIII in the Irish Parliament created a crisis that would fundamentally alter the relationship between England and Ireland. Thomas's rebellion revealed both the military capabilities and political limitations of Anglo-Irish resistance to Tudor authority. His forces initially achieved significant success, capturing several royal castles and gaining support from both Anglo-Irish families and Gaelic lords who opposed English rule. However, the rebellion also demonstrated the practical difficulties of maintaining coordinated resistance against English military intervention when supported by adequate resources and professional leadership. With the arrival of English reinforcements under Sir William Skeffington in 1535, gradually turned the tide against the rebels through systematic siege warfare and the effective use of artillery that could breach Irish fortifications. The suppression of the Kildare Rebellion marked the beginning of more direct English involvement in Irish governance, as Henry VIII recognised that the traditional policy of ruling through Anglo-Irish magnates had become incompatible with his broader political objectives. The execution of Silken Thomas and his 5 uncles in 1537 eliminated the male line of the Kildare Fitzgeralds, while sending a clear message about the consequences of rebellion against Tudor authority. This dramatic break with previous English policy toward Anglo-Irish families demonstrated Henry's willingness to employ ruthless methods to establish royal supremacy in Ireland. The establishment of a permanent English garrison in Ireland following the Kildare Rebellion created new military capabilities that enabled more systematic English control over Irish territories. The garrison, initially numbering approximately 500 men, provided a professional military force that could respond quickly to Irish challenges while supporting the authority of English-appointed officials. The cost of maintaining these forces required substantial increases in English expenditure on Irish affairs, but it provided the military foundation necessary for more ambitious policies of territorial expansion and administrative reform. Henry's assumption of the title King of Ireland in 1542 represented a fundamental transformation in the legal and political relationship between England and Ireland. The change from Lord of Ireland, a feudal title that acknowledged papal authority over the island, to King of Ireland asserted direct royal sovereignty that derived from Henry's own authority rather than papal grant. This transformation reflected Henry's break with Rome and his assertion of royal supremacy in religious matters, but it also created new legal frameworks that would facilitate more systematic English control over Irish affairs. But with this new title came a new policy, and it was designed to transform Gaelic lords into English nobles through a process called surrender and regrant. Some would accept, others would resist. And the stage was being set for the final, bloody conquest of Gaelic Ireland. The policy of surrender and regrant that accompanied Henry's assumption of the Irish crown offered Gaelic lords the opportunity to exchange their traditional territorial rights for English noble titles and legal recognition of their lands under English law. This policy represented a sophisticated attempt to integrate Gaelic political structures into English legal frameworks while maintaining existing power relationships under new forms of legitimacy. Lords who accepted surrender and regrant received English titles, legal protection for their territories, and recognition as legitimate participants in English political structures. The implementation of surrender and regrant achieved mixed results that reflected the complex political calculations involved in such fundamental legal transformations. Some Gaelic lords, particularly those facing military pressure from English forces or rival Irish clans, found the policy attractive as a means of securing their territories and gaining access to English legal protections. Con Bacach O'Neill's acceptance of the title Earl of Tyrone in 1542 demonstrated how traditional Irish leaders could adapt to English legal frameworks while maintaining effective control over their territories and followers. However, many Gaelic lords remained suspicious of English intentions and reluctant to abandon traditional forms of authority that had served their families for centuries. The policy's requirement that lords adopt English customs, speak English, and govern their territories according to English law created cultural and practical challenges that many found unacceptable. The complex inheritance patterns that characterized Irish law, including the practice of tanistry that selected successors based on merit rather than primogeniture, proved particularly difficult to reconcile with English legal requirements. The introduction of the Protestant Reformation to Ireland created additional complications that would profoundly affect the island's political and cultural development for centuries. Henry VIII's break with Rome and his assertion of royal supremacy over religious matters challenged fundamental assumptions about spiritual authority that had characterized Irish Christianity since the 5th century. The dissolution of the monasteries begun in Ireland during the 1530s eliminated religious institutions that had served as centers of learning, economic activity, and cultural preservation for nearly a millennium. The practical implementation of monastic dissolution in Ireland proceeded gradually and often incompletely due to the administrative challenges involved in identifying, evaluating, and disposing of monastic properties throughout the island. English officials lacked detailed knowledge of Irish religious institutions and their complex relationships with local communities, while the resistance of monastic communities and their lay supporters created practical obstacles to systematic dissolution. Many smaller religious houses simply continued their activities without official recognition, while others transformed themselves into secular, educational, or charitable institutions. The redistribution of monastic lands created new opportunities for English settlers while disrupting traditional economic relationships that had sustained Irish communities for centuries. The Crown's grants of former monastic properties to English adventurers and loyal Irish lords created new forms of landholding that operated according to English legal principles rather than traditional Irish customs. These changes generated substantial revenues for the Crown while providing incentives for English settlement that would gradually transform the demographic composition of many Irish regions. The religious changes accompanying the Reformation created cultural and political divisions that transcended ethnic boundaries while creating new forms of identity that would influence Irish politics for centuries. Many Anglo-Irish families, despite their English origins and political connections, remained committed to Catholic religious practices that connected them with broader European Catholic culture. Their resistance to Protestant religious reforms created common ground with Gaelic Irish populations while potentially compromising their loyalty to English political authority. The stage was set for religious warfare, and it was coming sooner than anyone expected. The reign of Mary then until I temporarily reversed the Protestant Reformation in Ireland while creating new uncertainties about the island's religious and political future. The Queen's restoration of Catholic religious practices and her reconciliation with Rome provided relief for Irish Catholics who had opposed Protestant reforms, but it also created questions about the permanence of these changes and their implications for English policy toward Ireland. The brief Catholic restoration demonstrated the continuing importance of religious identity in Irish politics, while revealing the practical difficulties of implementing systematic religious changes in a politically fragmented society. The accession of Elizabeth I in 1558 restored Protestant religious policies while creating new challenges for Irish Catholics who had hoped that Mary's reign represented a permanent return to traditional religious practices. Elizabeth's religious settlement attempted to create a moderate Protestant church that could accommodate diverse religious opinions, but its implementation in Ireland faced obstacles that reflected the island's complex political and cultural landscape. The Queen's assertion of royal supremacy over religious matters challenged traditional Irish Catholic loyalties, while creating potential conflicts between religious and political allegiances. The gradual expansion of English administrative control during Elizabeth's reign proceeded through systematic establishment of new governmental institutions that could implement royal policies throughout Ireland. The creation of provincial councils in Munster and Connaught provided regional administrative structures that could coordinate English policy while accommodating local political conditions. These councils combined English administrative procedures with knowledge of local customs and political relationships, creating hybrid governmental systems that reflected the complex character of Tudor rule in Ireland. So the appointment of English-born officials to key administrative positions represented a significant departure from earlier policies that had relied heavily on Anglo-Irish families for governmental leadership. Officials like Sir Henry Sidney, who served multiple terms as Lord Deputy during Elizabeth's reign, brought direct experience of English governmental procedures while lacking the local connections and cultural knowledge that had characterized Anglo-Irish administrators. This change in personnel reflected Elizabeth's determination to establish more direct royal control over Irish affairs while creating tensions with established Anglo-Irish families who had traditionally dominated colonial administration. The military innovations that accompanied expanded English control included the development of professional military forces equipped with modern weapons and trained in contemporary European military techniques, the establishment of permanent garrisons at strategic locations throughout Ireland provided the military foundation necessary for systematic territorial expansion, while creating new forms of military organization that differed fundamentally from traditional Irish warfare methods. These forces employed firearms, artillery, and coordinated infantry tactics that proved highly effective against traditional Irish military formations. The introduction of plantation policies during Elizabeth's reign represented the most systematic attempt to transform Irish society through large-scale colonization by English and Scottish settlers. The Munster plantation, established following the suppression of the Desmond rebellions during the 1580s, created new forms of colonial settlement that aimed to replace Irish populations with Protestant settlers who would be loyal to English political and religious authority. The plantation's design reflected contemporary theories about colonization that emphasized the importance of creating self-sufficient agricultural communities that could defend themselves while generating revenues for the crown. But the plantation's implementation proved more complex than its theoretical framework suggested. English settlers faced challenges including hostile Irish populations, unfamiliar environmental conditions, and inadequate military protection. And in Ulster, the most Gaelic region of Ireland, resistance was about to explode into the most serious military challenge Elizabeth would face. The 9 Years' War was coming, and it would be led by a man who understood both English and Irish ways of war perfectly. The 9 Years' War represented the most serious challenge to English authority in Ireland since the Anglo-Norman conquest, as Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, successfully coordinated Gaelic-Irish resistance while securing military support from Catholic Spain. O'Neill's political position as both an English earl and a traditional Gaelic lord enabled him to appeal to diverse constituencies while maintaining the diplomatic flexibility necessary for sustained resistance to English expansion. His military innovations included the adoption of European military techniques and the recruitment of professional soldiers who could match English forces in formal battlefield engagements. The alliance between O'Neill and Red Hugh O'Donnell of Tyrconnell created a formidable coalition that controlled much of Ulster while projecting military power throughout Ireland. Their combined forces employed sophisticated military strategies that maximised their advantages in local knowledge and popular support while avoiding direct confrontations with English armies in circumstances that favoured European military technologies. The rebels' success in maintaining coordinated resistance for nearly a decade demonstrated the continuing vitality of Gaelic political structures while revealing the limitations of English military power in Irish conditions. And the Spanish intervention at Kinsale in 1601 represented the international dimensions of the 9 Years' War while demonstrating the potential for Catholic European powers to challenge English control over Ireland. The arrival of approximately 3,400 Spanish troops under Don Juan de Aguilar provided O'Neill and O'Donnell with professional military support that could match English capabilities while creating opportunities for coordinated operations that might achieve decisive victory. The Spanish choice of Kinsale as their landing site reflected strategic calculations about the most effective location for supporting Irish resistance while maintaining communication with Spain. The Battle of Kinsale on December 24, 1601, proved to be the decisive engagement of the 9 Years' War, as the defeat of the combined Irish and Spanish forces eliminated the last realistic possibility of successful resistance to English conquest. The battle arose when O'Neill and O'Donnell marched south to coordinate with the Spanish garrison, while English forces under Lord Deputy Mountjoy besieged the town. The Irish leaders' decision to abandon their traditional guerrilla tactics in favour of a conventional assault on English positions reflected their assessment that only dramatic victory could salvage their cause, but it also played to English military strengths while minimising Irish advantages. But the English victory resulted from superior coordination between their various forces and their ability to maintain defensive positions against Irish assault rather than from overwhelming technological advantages. The aftermath of Kinsale saw the systematic collapse of Gaelic resistance throughout Ireland as O'Neill and O'Donnell found themselves unable to maintain their coalition without Spanish support. The English scorched earth tactics that followed the battle created widespread famine and displacement that eliminated the demographic foundations of Irish resistance while demonstrating the ruthless methods that English commanders were prepared to employ to achieve complete victory. The death of hundreds of thousands of Irish civilians during this period represented one of the greatest demographic catastrophes in Irish history. But the Treaty of Mellifont in 1603 formalised O'Neill's submission to English authority while marking the effective end of independent Gaelic political structures in Ireland. The treaty's terms required O'Neill to abandon his traditional title of the O'Neill while accepting his position as Earl of Tyrone under English law, symbolising the transformation of Gaelic lordship into English nobility. The agreement provided for the preservation of O'Neill's territorial holdings while requiring his acceptance of English legal and administrative systems throughout his domains. But O'Neill knew this compromise couldn't last. The English wanted complete control, complete transformation, total submission, and in 1607 he would make the decision that we witnessed at the beginning of this story. The flight of the Earls in 1607, when O'Neill, O'Donnell, and other Gaelic lords departed Ireland for continental Europe, marked the definitive end of the old Gaelic order that had characterised Irish society for over a millennium. Their departure eliminated the traditional leadership structures that had maintained Irish political independence while creating opportunities for more systematic English colonisation of their territories. The Earls' decision to seek exile rather than accommodation reflected their assessment that meaningful autonomy was no longer possible under English rule. The immediate aftermath of the flight saw English authorities move swiftly to confiscate the departed lords' territories, declaring them forfeit to the Crown through attainder proceedings that provided legal justification for wholesale land redistribution. The confiscated lands encompassed approximately 500,000 acres across 6 Ulster counties: Donegal, Derry, Tyrone, Armagh, Fermanagh and Cavan, representing some of the most fertile and strategically important territories in Ireland. The scale of the confiscation created unprecedented opportunities for systematic colonisation while eliminating the last major concentration of independent Gaelic political authority. The Ulster plantation that followed the flight of the Earls represented the most systematic colonial project undertaken in early modern Ireland, as English and Scottish settlers received grants of land according to carefully designed plans that reflected contemporary theories about effective colonisation. The plantation's architects divided the confiscated territories into estates of varying sizes, with larger grants going to major English and Scottish undertakers who committed to bringing substantial numbers of Protestant settlers. Smaller grants went to servitors, English officials and military officers who had served in Ireland, and to approved native Irish landowners who had demonstrated loyalty to the Crown. The plantation's design reflected lessons learned from earlier colonial experiments, while incorporating contemporary theories about the most effective methods for establishing permanent settlement in hostile territories. The planners required undertakers to construct fortified buildings, establish towns, and bring specified numbers of Protestant settlers from England and Scotland. The settlements were to be segregated, with English and Scottish tenants occupying separate territories from native Irish populations who were to be removed to less desirable lands. These provisions aimed to create self-sufficient Protestant communities that could defend themselves while remaining loyal to English political and religious authority. The practical implementation of the Ulster plantation proved considerably more complex than its theoretical framework suggested, as undertakers faced challenges including inadequate capital, hostile Irish populations, and difficulties in recruiting sufficient numbers of reliable settlers. Many plantation grants remained underdeveloped or were abandoned entirely when their English or Scottish proprietors proved unable to attract settlers or protect their territories against Irish resistance. The survival of substantial Irish populations within plantation areas created social and economic relationships that often differed significantly from the ethnic segregation that plantation designers had envisioned. Nevertheless, the Ulster plantation succeeded in transforming the demographic composition of Northern Ireland through the introduction of substantial Protestant populations from England and Scotland. The estimated 40,000 English and Scottish settlers who arrived during the first decades of plantation represented a demographic transformation unprecedented in Irish history. These settlers brought with them not only different religious practices but also different agricultural techniques, social customs, and political traditions that would fundamentally alter Ulster's cultural landscape. The plantation's success in establishing permanent Protestant communities created the foundations for divisions that would shape Irish politics for centuries, as the descendants of English and Scottish settlers developed distinct identities that combined elements of their ancestral cultures with adaptations to Irish conditions. But the Ulster plantation was more than a demographic project. It was the final act in the conquest of Gaelic Ireland. The end of medieval Ireland thus occurred not through a single dramatic event, but through the gradual transformation of political, social, and cultural structures that had characterized Irish society since the early Christian period. The Tudor conquest eliminated the political independence that Gaelic lords had maintained for centuries, while creating new forms of colonial administration that operated according to English rather than Irish principles. The establishment of English legal and administrative systems eliminated the jurisdictional pluralism that had characterized medieval Ireland, replacing Brehon law with English common law and substituting English governmental institutions for traditional Irish political structures. The religious changes that accompanied the Reformation challenged fundamental assumptions about spiritual authority, while creating new forms of identity that would influence Irish politics for centuries. As the enforcement of Protestant religious conformity created a religious divide that increasingly separated English settlers from the Catholic majority of Ireland's population, both Gaelic Irish and Old English. This religious division would become the defining characteristic of Irish political conflict in subsequent centuries, transcending the ethnic distinctions between Gaelic Irish and Anglo-Norman descendants that had characterized medieval politics. The demographic changes resulting from war, famine, and plantation altered the ethnic composition of Irish society while introducing new cultural influences that would gradually transform traditional Irish customs and practices. The waves of English and Scottish settlers brought by Tudor conquest and plantation policies created substantial Protestant populations in areas that had been overwhelmingly Gaelic Catholic. These new communities established their own institutions, maintained their own cultural practices, and developed identities that distinguished them from both their countries of origin and the Irish populations among whom they settled. The economic transformations that accompanied English conquest included the introduction of new agricultural techniques, commercial practices, and property relationships that operated according to English rather than Irish economic principles. The replacement of traditional Irish systems of communal landholding and pastoral agriculture with English concepts of private property and intensive cultivation fundamentally altered the relationship between Irish populations and the land they inhabited. These changes created new forms of wealth accumulation while disrupting traditional economic relationships that had sustained Irish communities for centuries. The cultural impact of Tudor conquest extended beyond political and economic transformations to encompass systematic attempts to eliminate or suppress Irish language, music, poetry, and other forms of cultural expression that English authorities viewed as obstacles to complete Anglicization. The decline of bardic schools, the suppression of Gaelic learning, and the marginalization of Irish language in official contexts represented cultural losses that paralleled the political and territorial losses accompanying conquest. However, these cultural traditions would survive in diminished form, preserved by communities that maintained Irish identity despite political subjugation. The military innovations that enabled Tudor conquest demonstrated the increasing technological gap between European military capabilities and traditional Irish warfare methods. The effective use of artillery, firearms, and disciplined infantry formations gave English forces decisive advantages that traditional Irish tactics could not overcome. The systematic application of scorched earth strategies and the deliberate use of famine as a weapon of conquest revealed the ruthless methods that English commanders were prepared to employ to achieve complete subjugation. The establishment of permanent English garrisons and the construction of networks of fortifications throughout Ireland created military infrastructure that could maintain control over conquered territories while suppressing any attempts at resistance. But perhaps the most profound transformation was simply this. After 1607, there was no longer any part of Ireland that remained outside English control. No independent Gaelic lordships, no autonomous Anglo-Irish magnates, just crown authority extending across the entire island. The transition from medieval to early modern Ireland, marked by the flight of the earls, represented more than political conquest. It signified the end of a civilization that had flourished for over 1,000 years. The Gaelic Ireland that produced the Book of Kells, that preserved classical learning during Europe's Dark Ages, that developed sophisticated legal codes and poetic traditions, that maintained its independence against Viking invasions and partial Norman conquest, this Ireland was gone. The monasteries that had been centres of learning for a millennium were dissolved or repurposed. The bardic schools that had trained poets through 12-year apprenticeships were closing. The brehons, who had memorized and interpreted Irish law for generations, were being replaced by English-trained lawyers. The Gaelic lords who had ruled their territories according to customs stretching back to pre-Christian times were dead, exiled, or reduced to English tenants on their ancestral lands. The Irish language, which had been the language of learning and literature, of law and diplomacy, was being pushed to the margins, surviving among the poor and powerless but disappearing from official contexts. The transformation was comprehensive and systematic. English authorities weren't content with political submission. They wanted cultural transformation. They wanted to make Ireland English, not just in government, but in language, religion, law, agriculture, social customs, and identity. The plantation policies that followed the flight of the earls aimed to achieve through demographic replacement what centuries of warfare had failed to accomplish: the complete Anglicization of Ireland. The introduction of large-scale Protestant settlement, particularly in Ulster, created communities whose descendants would maintain distinct identities and political loyalties that differed fundamentally from those of the Catholic majority. These divisions, rooted in the conquests and plantations of the Tudor and early Stuart periods, would shape Irish politics for centuries and continue to influence Irish society into the modern era. The long-term consequences of Tudor conquest extended far beyond the immediate political and territorial losses. The systematic destruction of traditional Irish political structures, the suppression of Irish cultural institutions, and the imposition of English legal and economic systems created forms of colonial domination that would persist for centuries. The relationship between Ireland and England that emerged from Tudor conquest was fundamentally colonial in character, with Ireland reduced to subordinate status within an English-dominated political system that extracted resources and enforced conformity while denying Irish populations meaningful political autonomy. Yet even in defeat, elements of Irish culture survived. The Irish language persisted, spoken by the majority of Ireland's population despite official discouragement. Irish music, storytelling, and oral traditions continued in communities throughout the island, preserving cultural memories and maintaining distinct Irish identity despite political subjugation. The Catholic Church, despite persecution and legal disabilities, maintained its organizational structures and continued to serve the religious needs of Ireland's Catholic majority. These surviving elements of Irish culture would provide foundations for later movements of cultural revival and political resistance that would eventually challenge and ultimately overthrow English colonial rule. But that story belongs to a different era, the early modern and modern periods that followed the end of medieval Ireland in 1607. The medieval period we've explored covered 1,200 years of Irish history, from the establishment of small kingdoms in the 5th century through the golden age of Irish monasticism, the Viking invasions and settlements, the Norman conquest and partial colonization, the Gaelic resurgence and cultural flowering, and finally the Tudor conquest that brought this era to its definitive close. Throughout this journey, we've witnessed the remarkable resilience and adaptability of Irish society as it absorbed successive waves of invaders, Vikings who became Norse-Irish, Normans who became more Irish than the Irish themselves, while maintaining core elements of cultural identity that distinguished Ireland from its neighbours. We've seen how Irish monasticism preserved and transmitted classical learning during Europe's darkest centuries, making Ireland a beacon of scholarship and artistic achievement. We've examined the sophisticated legal systems, poetic traditions, and political structures that characterized Gaelic Ireland at its height. We've traced the complex processes of cultural interaction and adaptation that created hybrid communities combining Irish and foreign elements in creative synthesis. We've witnessed the gradual erosion of Irish independence through Norman conquest, the partial recovery during the Gaelic resurgence of the 14th and 15th centuries, and the final catastrophic collapse during the Tudor conquest of the 16th and early 17th centuries. The story of medieval Ireland demonstrates both the strengths and vulnerabilities of a decentralized political system that emphasized local autonomy and cultural continuity over centralized state power. The same political fragmentation that allowed Irish culture to flourish and adapt also prevented the coordinated resistance necessary to repel systematic conquest by more centralized and militarily advanced foreign powers. The Tuatha system that had served Ireland well for centuries proved inadequate when confronted with the organized military and administrative capabilities of the Tudor state. The religious divisions introduced by the Reformation added new dimensions to political conflicts while creating lasting divisions within Irish society that transcended traditional ethnic and cultural boundaries. The transformation from medieval to early modern Ireland involved not only political conquest but fundamental changes in religious identity, cultural practices, economic relationships, and social structures that would influence Irish development for centuries. The flight of the Earls in 1607 marked the definitive end of this medieval period, eliminating the last independent Gaelic lordships and creating conditions for systematic English colonization that would transform Ireland's demographic and cultural landscape. Yet the story of medieval Ireland retains profound relevance for understanding modern Irish history and identity. The cultural achievements of the medieval period, the magnificent illuminated manuscripts, the sophisticated legal traditions, the rich literary heritage, continue to inspire pride and serve as symbols of Irish cultural distinctiveness. The memory of lost independence and cultural suppression continues to inform Irish political consciousness and nationalist movements, and the divisions created by Tudor conquest and plantation policies continue to shape political relationships within Ireland and between Ireland and Britain. Understanding medieval Ireland is essential for comprehending the complex historical roots of modern Irish identity, the sources of continuing political divisions, and the resilience of Irish cultural traditions despite centuries of foreign domination. The monks who created the Book of Kells, the warriors who fought at Clontarf, the lords who sailed from Rathmullan in 1607, their world is gone, but their legacy remains. Subscribe to Flow of History to explore more epic transformations of medieval civilizations, from the rise and fall of the Byzantine Empire to the 100 Years' War to the Spanish Reconquista, where cultures clashed, identities evolved, and the medieval world gave birth to our modern age through centuries of conflict, conquest, adaptation, and survival that shaped the nations we know today.